the antenna, capturing the actual digitized radio waves millions of times per second. Possible suspects.
So what kind of satellites and countries were in these 14?
Well, there were several interesting candidates. One was a satellite operated by Algeria, and it even had, on public documentation, a transmitter in the same frequency band we were seeing interference on.
So they took a closer look, and on paper it fit. It was visible to all of the reference stations, and it could transmit in exactly the band they were seeing. This looked like it could be the answer. But they had a nagging doubt that some of the most distant stations in Svalbard and western Greenland, this satellite was barely above the horizon, which meant if it was the source, the signal would have to be skimming across the Earth and just barely glancing into the antenna of these receivers. Now that's not impossible. Low-angle signals can be picked up, but the more researchers looked, the less certain they became that this satellite was actually the source. So they examined data from GNSS receivers that were tracking this satellite during the interference events.
It looked just like all of the other ordinary GPS signals that were getting hammered by this interference. So the ratio of the signal power to the background noise also dropped, and dropped in the same proportion that the other GPS signals were dropping at the same time. This was not the attacker. This was just another legitimate signal in the L-band that had been interfered with.
The Algerian satellite wasn't the source. It was another victim. But what about the other 13? Any one of them could have been visible to all the stations at once. So geometrically, they could all be the culprit. But that's where the trail started to go cold. I mean, none of them had clear public documentation showing they could transmit and jam the right frequencies. And some of them had barely any public information at all.
We couldn't narrow it down further because of all of these things we didn't know about the signals they were broadcasting, how intense they were, what their pattern was. So there we were, stuck for about 4 months.
And there was an even more fundamental problem. Everything they'd done so far relied on one idea, that all of these interference events were coming from a single satellite.
It was under a really controversial assumption. Controversial in that my student and I just couldn't come to fully embrace this assumption. If we broke our assumption, then that would relieve the focus on geostationary satellites. Then we could open up the focus on many other satellites. But now instead of 13 remaining on our list, it would expand to, maybe 100 or more satellites.
And suddenly, instead of closing in on an answer, it felt like they were back at square one. So they needed a completely different approach. All the data they had was from GNSS receivers that process everything internally. They lock onto satellites, track signal strength, and then output a clean, simplified measurement, how strong that signal is compared to the background noise. And they do that just once per second. But these interference bursts only lasted 3 to 5 seconds, which means each event is captured in just a handful of samples. You can see that the signal dropped, but not precisely when it dropped. Not with enough timing resolution to compare one receiver to another, to see which one was hit first, or how the interference moved across the network. What they needed was the raw radio signal itself. So they started designing specialized receivers that could capture the data in much higher temporal resolution. The plan was to deploy them all across Europe. But building them, installing them, and waiting for new events to happen would take months, maybe years. So in September 2025, they took their investigation public at the Institute of Navigation Conference in Baltimore. And the response was immediate. The room was packed. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What was this satellite and who was responsible?
Honestly, it was one of the most fun meetings I've been part of. It was almost like we had been brought together for a big brainstorming session to see if we could crack this problem as a community that my student and I had not been able to crack by ourselves.
The question of a mystery satellite propagated throughout the research community. The German Aerospace Center came up with an ambitious plan to take a large tracking dish, point it at candidate satellites, and try to catch the interference in real time.
But remember, we're trying to catch a needle in a haystack that only shows up over a short interval and only happens once, maybe once or twice a month.
They tracked satellite after satellite, and nothing. No signal, no anomaly, no breakthrough. Yet again, the trail went cold. Weeks passed, then months, until an email arrived.
I looked at the email and then I had to reread it because it was almost like it had come right out of my dreams. You know, this can't possibly be true. He had beautiful raw data from 2 different stations.
At last, they had what they'd been missing, the raw radio signal itself. Samples of the raw voltage off the antenna capturing the actual digitized radio waves millions of times per second. From 2 stations, one in Amsterdam in the Netherlands and one in Trondheim in northern Norway. They captured these interference events on February 11th, 2026. And now, rather than asking how strong is the signal, they could ask, when did it arrive? With this raw data, they isolated a 2.3 second window where both stations recorded the same event. And because they were sampling at tens of megahertz, they could align the 2 datasets to pinpoint the exact moment the jamming signal arrived at both stations. This meant they could measure the tiny difference in when the signal reached each station. Imagine the signal reaches Trondheim roughly 139 microseconds before it reaches Amsterdam. Well, that tells you that the source must be slightly closer to Trondheim than it is to Amsterdam. And that constraint gives you a shape, a curve in space of all the possible locations of the source where that exact timing difference would be observed. In 3 dimensions, that becomes a kind of warped surface, a hyperboloid. Whatever transmitted the signal had to lie somewhere on that surface. And because the raw data was so incredibly high resolution, the margin of error, the thickness of that shape, stretching tens of thousands of kilometers into space, was only about 5 meters.
And because we were so interested in avoiding errors, we just determined that we weren't not going to talk to each other for a week. We would do our separate thing for a week. And then we would come back together, compare notes, and we would hopefully have not made the same mistakes. And I presented my findings to Zach, and he presented his to me, and they were not the same. And I have to admit that because I'm the professor, I was pretty much insistent that my finding was correct. But then he pointed out a couple of other things, other checks that he had run. And then I realized that I had an error in my code. And once I fixed that error, I ended up getting exactly the same time difference of arrival that he did.
And now they had a way to test every possible satellite, not just the 14 from their earlier predictions. For each satellite, they took its known orbit and asked, if the signal came from here, what timing difference would we expect between Amsterdam and Trondheim? Then they compared that prediction to the real data. If it didn't match, the satellite was ruled out. And since they had a continuous 2.5 second recording, they could take this a step further. As the satellite moved, that hyperboloid would shift slightly through space. So the real source had to stay aligned with it the entire time, which made this test incredibly strict.
And only one satellite was anywhere near this time difference of arrival measurement. And in fact, it wasn't just near, it was dead on.
The only possible culprit was a Russian satellite, Cosmos 2546. It remained perfectly on the hyperboloid, aligning with their data to within 200 meters, which is well within the uncertainty of the satellite's publicly available orbital data. Now, it's worth saying here, this work is still new and it hasn't undergone peer review, but independent teams in Europe have verified aspects of these findings. There was only one slight issue. Cosmos 2546 was launched on the 22nd of May, 2020, so it couldn't explain events going back to 2019. But then they discovered that Cosmos 2546 is part of a constellation of 6 satellites. This constellation is part of Russia's early missile warning system.
It's basically part of their Golden Dome. If you've heard of the US Golden Dome, this is part of the sensory apparatus for the Russian missile detection system.
They sit in what's called a Molniya orbit, a highly elliptical path that carries them high over the northern hemisphere where they can slow down and linger. It's the way that high-latitude countries like Russia can get the benefits of something like geostationary orbit across multiple satellites. But this also means this constellation covers large parts of the globe, so they have the capability to jam GNSS across a far wider region than we've seen, including over the United States. The pattern already told us this wasn't random. The frequency told us it wasn't natural. And now we know it's coming from a military system in orbit. But intention? Well, that's harder to prove.
What is already being broadcast is enormously powerful. It's like hundreds of times more powerful than the GPS signals themselves.
But it's slightly offset from the GPS frequency, which seems odd. Because surely, if you want to jam GPS properly, you would put your jamming signal directly on top of it. Well, Todd actually has a theory about this.
If you're going to test this capability, then you test it in the neighborhood of the signal you intend to jam, but not right on that signal. And you test it only briefly, just to make sure everything's still working. And then in the eventual future where there is a hot conflict, they go ahead and tune their transmitter down to the GPS band, but it's much more damaging now that it lies right on that band.
So one possibility is this. What we've been seeing are tests, a system being exercised without fully revealing what it can do. And while just a theory at this point, there is another hint this might be the case. The raw data also revealed a second interference burst, aimed at a lower frequency, 1558.5 megahertz, which overlaps with signals from the Chinese Beidou navigation system.
I'll say it in the most conservative way possible. I can no longer say this is accidental with confidence. I'm leaning toward this being a periodic test of a capability that would be very damaging if it was deployed in anger.
But when we spoke to a team that had independently traced the signals back to satellites in Russia's missile warning system, they had another idea.
So there'll be very odd behavior to be continually testing something.
So our alternative theory is that those might actually be very short, very brief, very specific comms messages coming from those satellites.
And if that were true, transmitting messages on these frequencies would provide a layer of protection, because the enemy wouldn't want to jam them and risk disrupting their own navigation systems.
I'm not saying it's not the jamming. That's still a very strong possibility. I think the point is there are some odd things about that, and there is clearly here an alternative explanation.
But whether these signals were covert messages or tests of a space-based jamming system, the events themselves were incredibly brief. And that might explain something else. Why this went unnoticed for years. But if this system were ever fully switched on, the impact could be enormous. When we see maps of massive GPS interference today, you are almost entirely looking at reports from commercial aircraft affected by ground-based jammers. Typical airliners cruise at altitudes between 30,000 and 42,000 feet, which is high enough to remain in direct line of sight of jamming signals across vast distances. But at ground level, buildings and terrain shield much of our infrastructure from that interference.
But everything's line of sight from space, yeah. It's a invisible utility that supports virtually every technology, and it's essential to the way we live every day. The United States made GPS its gift to the world, and clever engineers took this free thing that works really well, very precise, and incorporated it into all kinds of systems. It's one of those wicked problems. You really don't know what all the dependencies are and where all the interconnections are, because it's just proliferated throughout the world.
Global satellite navigation systems underpin aviation and global shipping. It synchronizes financial systems, keeps cell towers on time. It is crucial for logistics networks, ride-hailing apps, delivery systems, even dating apps. A disruption of these systems across an area as large as what these satellites are capable of could affect hundreds of millions of people.
It would send shockwaves of fear through the world, not just through Europe, because an entirely new weapon from space would have been revealed. And people would know that at any time of their choosing, Russia could deploy this over their country or over their continent. I do think that this is a massive escalation in the electronic warfare background conflict that's going on right now.
Now, this sounds scary, but the truth is we should have been worried about this fragile system already.
The threat has always been there. Severe solar events could ionize the atmosphere and keep all kinds of signals from space from coming in, or it could destroy satellites. We could have a version of the Kessler effect in medium Earth orbit, and satellites be destroyed by debris. So everybody have already been concerned. They should continue to be concerned, and this is just another example of why.
But the good news is, we already know exactly how to fix the problem. It involves building a future system that doesn't rely entirely on weak satellite signals.
We suggest that